All right, so let's get started slowly. So hello everyone. Thanks for coming to this is our very first the State of Tech Enablement. So I appreciate you joining. So really quickly, my name is Marko. I started a company called Plus, and in previous life I was at Twitter University, running helping with engineering, onboarding and ongoing education and so forth, documentation, etc. And prior to that, we ran a software training company that was working with some of the most advanced technology companies at the time, helping them up level on open source technologies. So that's my background in the past 10, 15 years has been mostly around education, engineering education, and enablement. But really quickly, so the story behind this talk is that we also help run a community called Technocon that started back in 2018. It was initially started by myself and somebody from Rajan from LinkedIn and Jenny from Salesforce at the time. And we had a first annual in 2018, and then following year in 2019, we ran it at Twitter. And so this is the photo we took at the end of that. It's basically, I like to say it's almost like who's who of Silicon Valley or technology world, learning and development for tech people. So a lot of these people are speakers, and over the last couple of years, we've ran many of the talks where they got to share their stories and their experiences. So the State of Tech Enablement is really a compilation of what we've heard from other practitioners in the industry share, and that worked or didn't work for them. So that's basically what we're gonna do today. We're gonna share their stories. So as we get started, what do we mean by tech enablement? Well, we've been sort of in this business of like, let's help engineers and designers and data people and other technical people do their best work ever. And let's also enable organizations to scale that. So as we kind of get more people into the mix and enable them to get up to speed, how do we make sure that we scale that properly? So we kind of wanted to put a container around various activities. And so we came up with this term tech enablement to essentially mean everything from onboarding to knowledge sharing to peer and collaborative learning, mentorship, coaching, technical documentation, everything that basically promises to enable technical folks to do their best work. So that's roughly the container in which we're going to play today and look at some of the stories. So one of the things that we often hear when we talk about scale is that everything was great when we were a small organization, right? So a startup doesn't necessarily need technical enablement. Everyone's in, more or less in the same space, connected at the hip. There's very little internal know-how yet to be shared, and there's few people, so the connections between individuals is a relatively manageable set. So it's easy to connect the dots and talk to one another and kind of share that knowledge. And so this is true for organizations, I would say up to 50 to 100 employees, and then after that it gradually becomes harder and harder. And it's not easy to notice that it gets harder and harder. So it becomes one of those sort of the frog in a boiling water experiences where organizations start slowing down, and yet it may not be obvious right away. As one of the people we interviewed, he liked to point out that the number of connections between individuals in a company grows quadratically. So essentially, the more people you add, the more connections among those individuals you have, and that's when knowledge sharing becomes a harder and harder thing to deal with. So one thing that we're noticing is that some organizations, as they scale, they treat each team on their own. So essentially, this is especially true if you have the technical stack that's based on microservices, for example, where you end up with a number of teams, and each team is great. I remember when we were at Twitter, Twitter had a couple of hundred, I think it was 200-300 engineering teams, and so each team would say, "Hey, things are great on my team," right? Like people know what they need to know. The challenge was usually team-to-team communication. And so essentially what happens is you get this silos of knowledge. So things are great on my team. So it's back to that syndrome of everything was good when we were small. But organizationally, you have this hodgepodge of teams that don't work very well together. And so what I've heard leaders say is that they want nimble organizations. And this is exactly the opposite of that. It basically creates siloed organizations. So the desired outcome of tech enablement is high performance at scale. So we mentioned, as I mentioned earlier, things are great when we're small. As we start adding people, we experience organizational drag. So one way to kind of illustrate this is doubling the number of engineers does not double productivity. It often the factor is much smaller, and it can actually be even negative. We've seen organizations where adding extra people actually slows you down beyond the original headcount. So that's what we call organizational drag, and it's a real issue. And like we're noticing leaders really care about this. So another thing that we often hear is focus on culture and like wanting a culture of learning. But what does it really mean? And how do we get to that culture? And so culture is either something that we like to say either happens by chance or by choice. And so you're going to have it one way or another. So the invitation here is really to focus on building a culture by choice. So for each of these, I'm going to be referencing some stories. Like I said, this is really a compilation of things that we've heard over the years talking to leaders. So one of the stories I like to share first is that of Twitter. And so this was with Alex Rudder. He was the head of engineering at Twitter as Twitter was scaling rapidly. And when he took over, he basically went around and started talking to people, and he heard firsthand things like, as we mentioned, things were great when we were small, everything's now complex, and everything's fine on my team, but not beyond that. And so his insight was, as opposed to hiring, let's say we have 2,000 engineers, as opposed to hiring another 200 engineers, so growing the headcount by 10, how about we improve the effectiveness of existing engineers by 10%, right? So basically keep the headcount the same, but get everyone rowing in the same direction with the same level of shared understanding. So Alex, one of the first things that he did is he funded a team called Engineering Effectiveness, which was basically a combination of Twitter University, technical documentation, as well as tooling teams, right? So what do you need to enable engineers to do their best job? Well, they need the right tools and the right skills. So that was one of the things that he did. Another story that resonates with me and is interesting is from Facebook. So Wayne Chang was one of the first engineering managers at Facebook. Facebook used to be a small startup. So at this time, I believe there were about 200 people. So they were quote unquote tiny. And so basically what he noticed is that adding more developers was actually slowing them down. So he invested in funding engineering bootcamp at Facebook. And nowadays, that's probably considered one of the best engineering bootcamps in the industry. But that all started in the very early days. And it was an insight that funding such an initiative made sense at Facebook at that size, right? So this is a story from how they went about that, and why the way they hire and the way they onboard is very interesting and insightful. So that's a story from Facebook in the early days, and how high performance was something that they wanted to invest from get-go. Just a side note, both Alex and Wayne are investors in ++, so they believe in this beyond just their direct experiences at Twitter and Facebook. So they wanted to basically see this take place in the industry as a whole. So when we talk about tech enablement, we sort of wanted to talk about it as a shades of gray, as opposed to you either do it or you don't. So it's not a binary thing. It's more of a something to consider in terms of a maturity index. So we created this tech enablement maturity index, Tammy, and so I'll briefly walk you through that, and we'll look at each level and sort of share stories of companies at various levels of development. And you can kind of think about, like, for your organization, where might you be at and what's the next step? And so one way to kind of think about the levels is through funding. So so that also shows the level of investment in the cause, right? So level 1 is sink or swim. 2 is, so basically you don't do much, right? Hero volunteer is somebody steps up and says, I'll take care of that. Partial own, but it's not really sanctioned. It's not really their job. They're just kind of doing it as, you know, in the 120% time, so the 20% on top of 100%. So that's usually how hero volunteer experiences. Partial ownership is suddenly somebody's it's part of somebody's job to own it. Complete ownership is somebody actually is owning this concern. There's a person dedicated to tech enablement. And at level 5, there's usually a team that owns that, and so we'll talk about that. Sometimes this correlates to the size of a company. So obviously larger companies may or may not have better funded teams, but often we see companies also leapfrog or lag behind. So there are some large companies that don't invest a lot, or there's some smaller companies that have invested early on. So we'll look at some of the stories. And by the way, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat, and we'll also have time at the end to go through this as well and compare the notes. So, and the slide deck, we'll send it to you afterwards, so don't worry about reading all the text. That's more for your takeaway. So with that, let's talk about sink or swim. So this is basically the case when there's not much, if anything at all, right? So basically there is no onboarding at the organizational level at all. It usually means that hiring manager, it's their implicit job to onboard somebody. They're given few or possibly no tools whatsoever. And sometimes we also hear heads of engineering and other tech leaders basically say, well, HR owns it. And so that usually means HR provides sort of like the basic company onboarding, but there's very little to none technical onboarding. So we don't have an article on this, but we did a project at WeWork when there were 800 engineers, and they were doubling. So they were going basically from 800 to 1600 engineers. And literally their onboarding was, you get a brand new laptop, that MacBook, they show you where the bathrooms are at, and that's the end of it. So if you wanted to check out your Git repo, there was very little understanding how to get to that. It was very hard to even get all the logins. It would take you weeks of just trying to figure out who to ask for what credential to what repo and how to check it out and set up your environment. So there was very, very little at that time, and they were well into hundreds of developers. And they had some really great team. They just haven't had time to, they kind of neglected tech enablement as a thing. So they built a large organization very quickly with very little focus on enabling the developers to be great. GitHub was also interesting. I spoke with the head of engineering there, and they also did very little at the organizational level. When I say organizational, I mean Eng organizational, not company, right? And it was mostly up to managers to figure it their own. And so that's fine to an extent, except often what happens is every manager has to reinvent the wheel, and there's very little ability to compare notes from one manager to another to see what works well, what doesn't. So the next stage is hero volunteer. So somebody had enough and somebody basically wanted to step up and do something about that. And as I mentioned earlier, usually that somebody still has the full-time job doing whatever they're doing, usually coding. And on top of that, they're stepping up and trying to normalize onboarding, trying to create some kind of overview of the entire platform or how things work, or in some cases even get a group of people together to teach the initial onboarding, etc. So our first-hand experience was when we joined Twitter. So there was an old-timer, Ryan King. He kind of had enough of how poorly Twitter was doing onboarding at the time, and he basically went and started something called Flight School. And basically that was a collection of half an hour at most workshops led by other old-timers that would cover various aspects of what you needed to know in Twitter engineering. So there was, quick overview of the entire platform, history of Twitter, how to do secure coding, how to, set up your environment, that sort of thing. It was a hodgepodge, like a kitchen sink of useful workshops, but it was basically run part-time by Ryan at the time. We'll share later on the story from Carbon Health. And in the early days, they also had a developer who stepped up, and she basically said, we need to do something about this, started the program, and eventually funded it. So I'll talk about that a bit later. So this is the hero volunteer stage that we see as a sort of like a level 2 of tech enablement. Somebody is stepping up and doing something about that. So partial ownership usually means finally leadership has noticed that enabling new hires and is important. So that's usually the low-hanging fruit, engineering onboarding. And also they notice that there are sometimes new best practices that need to be disseminated through the entire organization so that people learn how to do things. So essentially somebody gets voluntold to own onboarding usually first and kind of take care of that. It could be an old-timer engineer, it could be a technical project manager. So it really depends on an organization. I mentioned a story of Carbon Health. So one second. So basically, Carbon Health was experiencing a very rapid growth. I believe when they went from 7 to 90 engineers in something like 6 months or 9 months, a very, very rapid growth. And you can imagine how, being at very small, they have a handful of engineers, you would not necessarily have a lot of this infrastructure pieces, such as how to onboard and what the architecture looks like and how properly to set up environment and so on. And so a person stepped up, and she basically, one of the engineers, and she started putting together some material, and eventually as that took initial shape, made the case for hiring a program manager to step in and help with all the logistics of it and manage the entire program. And so this is their story. And so there's more to that. Yeah, they, in this particular case, they leaned heavily on onboarding as the initial use case, leaned heavily on documentation, and started basically connecting the dots and getting the new hire connected to the right people internally so they can further learn from those social connections as they kind of go on their journey. The similar, we don't have an article on this, but it's a similar story to Carta, where they're growing rapidly, and TPM was basically tasked to own the engineering onboarding, went out and started tapping all timers on the shoulder, putting together a number of workshops and classes, and kind of doing that program that's similar to what Twitter Flight School did in the early days. So scheduling what he thought would be necessary for people to know as delivered by internal talent. So it's relying on internal experts to occasionally teach a workshop here and there. And this, in terms of volume, this usually means that you tap an expert on the shoulder to teach half an hour, maybe 2-hour workshop that's usually whiteboarded, so very little material, very little, it's not polished, it's the opposite, it's good enough, right? And you're tapping these internal experts to do this maybe twice a month. So the ask is relatively simple, right? So show up twice a month and do a quick workshop. The managing of that becomes a little bit of a nightmare. There's a lot of, as you can imagine, spreadsheets, making sure that the right people show up for the right workshops and the instructors are available, etc. So those are usually the challenges. So that's a partial ownership. So suddenly tech enablement is recognized and somebody owns it, even though that's not their full-time job. So full ownership, so we're seeing this at a number of companies where somebody is actually in charge, dedicated to this. They are hired to essentially own this program and do something about that. So I'll share a couple of stories. So collaborative learning at Spotify. So Spotify basically to them from the very top, from the leadership level, CEO level, growing people is important, right? Like they have the mantra that the only constant is a constant change, and so basically they set out to create a program. Their program was based on what we call collaborative or peer learning, where it's really about creating a culture in which engineers are just going to show up and teach, and then putting a little bit of a structure around that so that things that are delivered or offered make sense and are relevant to the people. So they've done some really interesting stuff. It's a really interesting story. Kia Motors was probably one of the sort of least tech companies, although they have some really amazing technology and people as well. But they relied on sharing this, basically doing peer learning as well. So Angela, who was part of single person in their L&D team, was inspired by what she heard from Airbnb. So at the time, Airbnb had a very active peer learning program, and so she basically said, "Hey, like this would be really cool to create a culture like this at Kia Motors down in LA." And so she partnered with us and launched the peer learning program that's been alive ever since. So the point is that this works beyond Silicon Valley and strictly software companies as well. So that was a good case. I saw Stuart join. So this was Stuart's story about Cruise and how to enable internal subject matter experts to basically stand up and share in a somewhat consistent way. Stuart, anything you wanted to add to this, or?
Yeah, I think that having this rests on having a group in the organization that's focused on bringing it all together, but also the realization, the reality is the knowledge that you need to bring together or have shared is owned by and can only be, it exists on the teams, not in you, the learning expert. So as much as you can enable those people to share out their ideas, you should do that. And you are the one who is the expert in that. They weren't hired to be storytellers necessarily, but the learning person probably was, you could say, in some way. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. Yeah, that was our experience when we joined Twitter. We were an acquisition, and we had a lot of material, what we call vanilla material, right? So Android training, Java training, Hadoop, Scala, etc. And then we joined Twitter, and then we realized that it wasn't about the vanilla classes that were readily available outside of the building. It was all about the internal knowledge that existed in the heads of those subject matter experts. So the challenge was then not how to teach, but how to enable others to share the knowledge. And so that was a big insight, and positive surprise was how willing people were to share the knowledge if enabled, right? So if you make it really straightforward and simple for them, and in your case, you created some contracts or construction stories, how to build such materials, and so it's really cool to see stories like that actually pan out across the industry, not just from us. And this is a story from Credit Karma. They started investing in their engineering onboarding super early, not just onboarding, but peer learning. So they really leaned heavily on peer learning. So Naz started the program around the same time we did. We actually did not know one another. We only kind of compared the notes later on. It was like, oh, wow, like what you do is very, very similar to what we did. So they have Credit Karma University that's focused on knowledge sharing, biasing technical folks, so designers, engineers, data people, but it also product people as well, but it also spans entire company. So Naz, it was her brainchild, and it took off fairly quickly. So that's the full ownership. So somebody actually owns this and is doing something about that. So that's level 4 that we have, and level 5 finally is you go beyond just a single person, and there's actually a team that owns this. And as you know, as it makes sense, often this team tends to be a part of a larger company, right? So a smaller company, you can't really afford often to have a team. So I'll just go through some stories just as an inspiration. So Microsoft in this talk shares a framework on how they onboard 1,200 engineers per month, right? So just I'll let it sit for a second. It's 1,200 engineers per month, right? Most of our companies don't even have 1,200 employees, right? Let alone onboard that many engineers monthly. So Microsoft is just humongous. I think they crossed 100,000 engineers. So doing anything at that scale is really remarkable. So of course they have not one team, but they have like a team of teams that is focused on learning across the company. So they have centralized learning team, and then each discipline has its own learning team, and then there's collaboration, but also independence across them. So just as a little bit of an inspiration there. Salesforce happens to be one of our early customers, so we got to work with them from day one, and they have a dedicated, we call it technical learning and development team. Their internal name is something else. It's always something else. So we kind of coined this as just a kind of moniker for all the learning and development teams that focus on technical folks. But they have about 18,000+ technical folks internally, and so they manage they manage learning for them at scale. So they have in their how they do it is slightly different. I'll talk about this later on when we talk about measuring, but they basically use external vendors quite a bit. So it's not, they don't rely as much on the internal content, and they schedule upfront literally hundreds of classes for tens of thousands of engineers, so every quarter. So it's a slightly different approach, and I'll mention it in more detail when we talk about external learning and how that works. And Netflix, this is actually one of the highest rated articles that we have, their internal checklist. So in this story, Jasmine, who is one of our board members at Technicon, she shares how they create some kind of consistency around their internal learning. So how do you actually create peer learning in other programs and scale that? So be the person behind the scenes that enables others, but scale it in such a way that there's a consistency, and yet knowing that your team, your technical L&D team, is not necessarily large, right? So one of the ways they do that is by codifying what best practices for peer learning look like, and they do that through checklists. So this is a story of how how their DevEd team does that. So that's what and then obviously we shared quite a bit about Twitter University just because we came from there. So there's a few stories there. This one is with Simeon Franklin, who is one of the I guess head instructors now, and came to Twitter University from day one with us as part of the acquisition. This is a story of how Twitter University is actually a tool for leadership, right? And what we mean by that is that it goes beyond just onboarding engineers onto how Twitter works and how we work at Twitter, but it's also a tool for disseminating some best practices. So for example, Jack would go on stage and say something like, Jack Dorsey, and say something like, machine learning is very important to Twitter, right? So how do you now get a message like that to disseminate through the entire company, cross-cutting through those silos of teams, right? And up-leveling the entire company onto what it means to do machine learning. So, and when I say entire company, it's down to recruiters and salespeople and product people and designers and engineers, and basically functionally across all the functions and cross-cutting across all the teams. And so Twitter University becomes a tool to basically propagate and uplift the organization on some such concerns like machine learning, like the new way to do experimentation, etc. So this was Simeon's story of looking at taking a holistic approach, what it means to do tech enablement for the entire company, right? So that's what a well-funded team looks like. So next, I'll go into some building blocks and some stories how companies have done that. So we'll talk about 4 or 5 things, and then we'll talk about some trends and leave some time hopefully for Q&A. In the meantime, if you have any questions, again, feel free to use chat. So onboarding tends to be a low-hanging fruit. So companies usually start here. We're scaling. We need to basically get those new hires when they're fresh. We assume they have all the technical skills, so they have the vanilla knowledge, but we need to indoctrinate them into how we do things here in the way of our organization. So that's usually what onboarding looks like. And like I've said, when we talk about TEMI, the Tech Enablement Maturity Index, companies do this all over the place. Some do nothing, some leave it to their managers, some leave it to HR, etc. So a couple of stories that I like. So LinkedIn, this is a story with Rajan, who is also a board member at Technicon. This is a story how they reconfigured their bootcamp to be remote first. There's also another story I'll mention later on when we talk about metrics, how LinkedIn created their engineering bootcamp, and it was basically to simulate the entire stack end to end. And so as a new hire, you would join and you would build a feature on a stack that looks very much like LinkedIn, and through that experience you get to see end to end what not only what LinkedIn stack looks like, but also what it takes to work with various teams that represent various parts of the stack. And then as the pandemic hit, they realized that their approach of Sunnyvale first office experience did not work anymore, so they retooled the entire program to be remote first, and so this is the story on that. Uber has an interesting story where they also went global, well, they went remote first during pandemic, and they're obviously a global company. But one thing that they realized is that they're a global company with a local context, right? So for example, if I am an engineer for Uber in India or in Switzerland, I do need to know something about Uber at large, but there's also the local context because they allow local teams to experiment and do their own things. So this is an interesting story of how they shipped enough, but also allowed local teams to fiddle with that and provide more context. So this is Cameron's story from Uber. Carbon health, we mentioned that again. So this was about scaling from a single digit to a double digit in a handful of months. So like something like 5 to 8x scaling the engineering in a very, very short amount of time as they kind of ramped up through the pandemic. So it's an interesting story as well. And we also had most recently, we had a panel discussion where we compared notes across couple of different companies, so Coinbase, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Netflix, and kind of shared what they've experienced in terms of the onboarding. So that's onboarding. So it's one of the tools in the toolbox that's a low-hanging fruit for what we consider engineering enablement or technical enablement. And I'll share, like I said, I see some stories, some questions in the chat. We'll be sharing this deck with the links later on, so you can, and all the links, so you'll be able to see all these articles as well. And there's also YouTube videos for each one, so you have basically the entire experience. So peer and collaborative learning is another tool in the toolbox for tech enablement. So this is basically what Stuart and I were earlier talking about is our job often is not to teach, but to enable others to stand up and share their insights, their knowledge, the subject matter experts. So, so Splunk is doing something interesting there. They're doing that through a concept called workshops, which is really more of a documentation that enables you to verify your work. So it's an interesting approach to how they are doing that. So this is their story. Twitter University is what Sasha and I have had our first-hand experience building. So this is the story where I shared my experience of what that looked like and how we built the program that basically was one of the highest rated engineering programs, and we had about 10% of engineers regularly teach classes. So it was well into hundreds of engineers that would regularly teach classes. I think we had like 10,000 plus student hours per month, and across hundreds of classes as well, workshops. Spotify, we mentioned this story earlier, how Spotify is leaning on what they call collaborative learning, so enabling their internal tech folks to stand up and share. So we mentioned that one. This is an interesting story from Netflix Studio, so not developer DevEd that I mentioned earlier, but Netflix Studio, and it's basically a story of so Netflix Studio has a lot of contractors, like tens of thousands of contractors that basically make the miniseries for them, and so this is and they also have a dozen plus tools that are homegrown proprietary tools for making this miniseries. So so they have a challenge of how do we onboard people onto how to work with Netflix Studios, right? And so they were doing workshops initially, then the pendulum sort of swung toward self-paced learning. They figured, hey, like that scales better. But then what they noticed is that they lost the human touch, right? So just throwing e-learning material at people didn't give them those results they wanted. They wanted to more indoctrinate people in the way and also the culture, which also includes the culture of Netflix Studios. So the pendulum kind of swung back toward live learning as well. So now they have a blended experience, which includes self-paced and live and office hours, and etc. As part of their experience. And so this is a story of LinkedIn again. So LinkedIn, in addition to onboarding that we mentioned earlier, they have a very rich Tech Talks program. So that the Tech Talks program started with a very senior engineer, and it blossomed, so grassroots, and he eventually handed it over to their tech enablement team, which then scaled it into hundreds of tech talks that happen monthly. And so this is their story and how that works there. So the next in the toolbox is tech docs, so technical documentation. We see a lot of companies sort of seeing that as a holy grail, right? Like if only everything was documented, if only we had a culture of documentation, things would be great. And so at Twitter, we happen to also run technical documentation team. At the time, Twitter had world's largest Confluence installation, hundreds of thousands of pages across, I think it was 200,000 pages across a couple hundred spaces. The challenge wasn't, do we document it? The challenge was what's believable in the documentation. So there was a lot of garbage in, garbage out, a lot of like, I would search for, how do I do X? And I would have 10 different competing answers to that. So what do I trust, etc. So those were the challenges. We ended up moving some of the docs to live closer to code and build the tooling to support that, putting some sort of templates and best practices and so on. This is a story of other companies in the industry and how they address that. So we had a panel with, this was LinkedIn, Uber, Spotify, and Splunk. They're all considered to have decent tech docs teams, and how they went about doing various kinds of documentation, from API to guides to onboarding to project docs, to docs that are owned by a single team, tech docs team, to those that are owned by each individual team, and so democratizing that, but yet putting some guardrails around that. So this is a story about that. But it's interesting that everyone is running into similar challenges and addressing it from a slightly different angle. And so one of the reasons why we started Technocon was so that we have a time and place to meet and compare notes with one another and learn from one another. So so this was a panel that we did just recently, a couple of months ago, with these companies. So you can read a summary about that, and for every one of these articles, there's also the video recording of the talk at the end. So mentorship, coaching, and office hours is another thing that we also see as thrown into the mix. So once I read all the docs and go through the workshops, etc., I may still be stuck. So I need somebody to tap on the shoulder to get unstuck. I may want to grow as maybe I'm a senior engineer, I want to become a staff engineer. Is there a mentorship program? We also often see buddy system happening for onboarding. Some companies are progressive enough to have a more of a professional mentorship or coaching programs. So I'll just share a couple of quick stories. One that was inspiring to me was Airbnb. So Airbnb basically said, hey, and this came directly from the leadership, from Brian. They basically said, we want to enable everyone to be a mentor to one another. So peer mentorship at scale. So they started a program where they were essentially teaching employees how to become mentors. And they scaled it to a few hundred. So in the first year, 10% of the company became mentors. I want to say 500 mentors internally, doing hundreds of mentorship sessions internally. So it became this like very lively, vivid experience where you can just go and tap and somebody and have a mentor. And this was like something that millennials especially loved, and so it really kind of took off. So this peer mentorship concept. Shopify did something different. This is a story how democratized coaching. So essentially, Toby, the founder, he had a personal executive coach, and it made a difference for him. And so he then said, "Hey, I'll bring my executive coach to coach other executives," and that worked. So it started from the top, from the upper echelon. And then they said, well, why don't we just make this available to entire Shopify? So they basically went out and recruited full-time a dozen professional coaches, right? Executive coaches. They basically scouted them across Canada and the US and built what's called the Coaches Corner. So they basically created this program, and any one of 4,000 plus employees could go and easily sign up for either half an hour coaching session or an hour coaching session. It just depended if you're a people manager or individual contributor. And so you could basically have a coach that was a pro, and you can ask questions and kind of do that. So that's kind of how they funded their program, and this is their story. Dropbox told us a story about how they were thinking about coaching and how they were thinking about scaling it. At the time, they were just piloting a program. They were just funded a team to do that. So Justin kind of spearheaded this at Dropbox. And basically the idea was to start with external coaches. So they would basically create a multi-tier of vendors. So go out, recruit professional vendors, coaches, bring them in-house, but use that to train internal coaches, and eventually develop internal coaching program that was based on executives and other managers who are professionally trained by external coaches how to coach. So this is their story, and as you can see, this journey was done. The interview was done in 2020, so the journey continues for them. So it's still up and running. This is something slightly different for Autodesk. I see Christian here. Oops. So this was about empowering managers by basically putting them together into a small group setting, so confidential, private group setting, where they can be vulnerable and basically, you know, ask questions and have an elder, like a more seasoned mentor, leader, manager in there to kind of mentor them and provide answers to that. Did I get it right, Christian? Anything to add to that?
You did. And I would say one thing, in addition to having more senior managers in those cohorts, we wanted to make sure that there were not direct reporting relationships, so that's something you may be concerned about asking your manager because you think it's something you should already know. You can ask this other person who's not part of your group, because that gives you some of that, as you mentioned, that confidentiality and that psychological safety.
Exactly. Yeah, that's important. So organizational distance in this case is a good thing, because then you can feel more vulnerable, right? There's no reporting structure and no conflict thus.
Exactly.
Yeah. Tan, who is in our team, wrote this article on how you might go around spinning up a mentorship coaching that runs itself. So I'll just leave it at that. There's some insights there. So it's based on our own sort of opinions. So that's coaching, mentorship, office hours. I wanted to also kind of mention this. We're seeing some companies rely on external expertise. Sometimes it's subscribing to libraries, content libraries, such as LinkedIn Learning or Pluralsight or Udemy, etc. So we see companies have that. We don't see a lot of stories on that. It's like a tool in the corner of the office. But I did want to mention Salesforce. I mentioned earlier. So Salesforce relies heavily not just on internal talent, but they actually work with external vendors to deliver classes. So basically, they would. Back in the day, it used to be the company that Sasha and I ran that ultimately got acquired by Twitter. But we would basically go and teach classes on advanced Java and open source technologies like that. So they rely heavily on that to provide up leveling of their technical talent. And they, like I said, they do that quite at a big scale. On the other side of a spectrum, there's a company called Essence. It's an e-tailer from Montreal. So they sell like $800 t-shirts, for example. And at the time they were tiny, 40 engineers. They wanted to double. They're now much, much bigger. So their business has taken off. But they wanted to basically spearhead this at the small scale. So I think 40 engineers, doubling. So they wanted to create a peer learning program, which I helped them with. But they also wanted to augment it with conferences. So to them, it was like great to learn from one another, but there's only so many of us in the building. How do we also provide access to conferences and external resources, send people there, but have them come back and share what they learned? So it wasn't just like, hey, here's a trip to Las Vegas to a conference, but you actually have to come back and tell people what you learn about the latest React or whatever JavaScript library you might have went to a conference for. So that's kind of their approach. And so this program has been working quite well. They went from 40 to 250 engineers in a few years. So they did something right. One of the things that they also wanted to do, which was interesting, is create a recruiting brand. They wanted to be known as the place for engineers to work for in Montreal area. So that was also why they invested in Essence University, which is their flagship program for tech enablement. So that's about external expertise. Measuring success is the final piece here to kind of close the building blocks. Everyone wants to know, well, great, we have all these things. How is it working? And obviously there's the infamous Kirkpatrick scale. Everyone's trying to do that. And everyone's finding that level 3 and 4 of that scale are super hard. Like, what's the impact of learning on business, right? And is the person using what they learned? So that in itself is hard. Leadership usually relies on stories. That's our experience. As much as they want to be data driven, they ultimately hear through a grapevine, what's working, what's not. So the squeaky wheel has a lot of power sometimes. So that's what we observed. Onboarding 0 to productivity is something important. So productivity might be measured as the first commit or the 10th commit or something like that. And I mentioned recruiting brand, focus on culture, and so on. Microsoft, being one of the super large companies, talks in this article about how they measure it. So they have a whole data science team behind measuring their learning culture and impact of that. So Chris Schaefer, who is also one of the board members at Technicon, and his team talk about this. So that's an inspiring story, even though it may not be super relevant to small organizations today. LinkedIn, Rajan, again, I mentioned earlier, talks about the metrics and how they went around measuring this. So that's something that's a little bit more of a more relevant, but it remains a hard topic to have clear how-tos about. We have a panel coming up in the next month or two on metrics, so we'll be sharing more what people are doing. And finally, just some trends. So if I had to like sort of sum up the state of tech enablement, so a couple of things we're seeing is that obviously pandemic happened, and obviously everyone had to move to remote first, experience for all this on the flip of a dime. And what we've discovered is that it's not as simple as just putting your in-person classes on Zoom. There's much more to that. So there's a lot more blended learning experiences that we're seeing. So is it in-person or self-paced? Well, it's neither or, it's a combination of. So there's a right, each is a tool, and there's a right way to use self-paced. There's a right way to combine it with in-person and create a holistic experience. And another thing that's interesting to us is that tech enablement is becoming a thing. And what I mean by that is we're seeing more and more companies be hiring for some version of that. They may call it engine enablement, they may call it tech L&D, something along those lines, where it's actually funding a person or a team to own the concern of up-leveling their technical folks. And I'm just putting asterisks there that we may be biased just because we tend to see people in the community that are doing that with Technicon. So that's that. So a couple of minutes for any questions, comments, concerns that came out of this? As I said, I'll share the deck with you directly afterwards. But any questions or comments?
One thing that comes to mind is what is the interaction you've seen with the other people organization groups? For instance, HRBPs tend to be, so in my experience, the HRBP group has been more mature before the L&D group, and they have more connections with all that engineering organization, for instance. And a lot of the goals of the learning and development group and technical enablement is attempting to produce are not the same as, but adjacent to sometimes what the HR organization is trying to accomplish. So can you speak a bit about like how you've seen the interaction between technical enablement and HRBPs? What's worked or not worked, or has the relation been present or not present?
Yeah, it's a great question. It always comes up. So in most innovative organizations, there's a healthy relationship between HR and engineering, or product teams. We're seeing tech enablement become funded as part of the engineering organizations more and more. It's sort of like, no sales leader would leave training salespeople to HR, right? Like it just doesn't make sense, right? So a similar thing, I think, is becoming obvious to tech leaders, that it's something that they need to own that concern of enabling people. Now, owning the concern may mean, hey, we'll create a team under engineering, or may mean we're going to partner with HR, but in a healthy way, right? Like where it's actually HR is bringing tools and best practices that they have, but they're almost like dedicating a person to be dedicated to engineering. So yeah, so that's what we're sort of seeing. But more and more, it's sort of like a concern of engineering, and so the question is just whether that person, once funded, sit HR or the tech team. And Stuart, did I answer that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I guess I'm looking for also just examples of zoomed in how it's gone, because I've just found that to be something that often comes up, and having a healthy relation. I haven't had strained relationships, like bad relationships, but like I'm always like, it would be better if I had better communication with, or better partnership with, or they were aware of what we were doing in tech enablement. I think it gets captured pretty well. And if the sales team they would have salespeople training salespeople that would really want that. And I think that captures it really well as a good translation to, if I was speaking to an engineering leader, why they want to have this locally.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we're seeing. That's why we even call this thing a tech enablement. It's a nod to sales enablement, right? So, yeah, cool. Well, thank you all. I know we're slightly over time. I'll be following up with the deck, so you'll get it, and it's got links to all the stories. Yeah, we see this as a sort of like a periodically run this and share what we're seeing in the industry and compare the notes. So kind of give you a high level overview. So I appreciate it. Thank you for your time.